дамы и господа.
Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are getting started. It's late, it's Wednesday, you must have your own plans for tonight, so we're getting started. My name is Alexey Ivanov. Tonight we're talking with our speaker, our guest, and we're going to cover a topic which unfortunately is underestimated in this urbanistic world, full of optimism about the tech-related changes. And at this stage we're in today, talking about problems, talking about challenges of this tech-related wave development. It's not yet common. I believe another stage will follow. We'll predominantly talk about problems the society is going to run into once we are overwhelmed by this wave. If we cannot be, even if we cannot be considered as an opposition, we are the so-called skepticism camp, and Yevgeny will agree with me or not, but we have to discuss this dilemma, this social choice. Where are we going towards full trust to technologies or full mistrust? There should be this balance we should strike. I'm a legal person. I've been working at the Higher School of Economics. I'm the director of the Institute of Law and Development at the High School of Economics. We focus on the legal regulation of new technologies and innovation. We closely focus on a problem as such, the structure of economic competition due to digitalization, biotechnology, preceding the digital technology, and we also look at the ways governments should respond to those challenges in the context of tech-related changes. This is my profile. Our today's guest is Yevgeny Morozov. He has a degree in history, PhD in history. Lately, he has been focused on very relevant, pressing issues. There may be no future without the past, and we focus on the future, taking into account our past, laws of society development. Yevgeny is famous for his two large publications. One book is on our disappointment on the development of the web. It was published in 2010, the so-called net delusion of the web, and a more recent book on the so-called big tech companies, large companies in the technology field, the way these companies influence the overall public. This has been reflected in the mass culture. For instance, the recent movie Circle, A Coast in the Shell. And this movie covers the influence by large tech companies on everything, Ghost in the Shell. Yevgeny is also known as a columnist with Guardian on tech-related development. That's it for our introductory remarks. I would like Yevgeny to add a couple of words about himself as a short introduction, then I'll proceed with questions. Our session today will be structured as a dialogue, as an interview. We'll stick to English because Urbi et Orbi, we're going to address this audience in English because this is the so-called Latin of today. Since Yevgeny largely works in the Western countries, he feels more comfortable speaking English because it's far. I'm going to stick to English because it's far easier for me to stick to English.
I have been studying for the last 5-7 years a more, let's say, historical approach to information society, if you want to put it, starting even with the history of cybernetics in the 1940s, trying to connect it to the Cold War, and it's a fascinating piece of research. But I also have this more contemporary critique, if you want to put it that way, of the influence that big tech exercises upon our lives, our economy, and increasingly upon our cities. And I guess this urban element of big tech is in itself something to be explored, because even companies like Google, which have mostly been focusing on things that had nothing to do with cities, like selling advertising or producing operating system like Android, even companies like Google are increasingly moving into cities. They set up, in the case of Google, a dedicated unit called Sidewalking Labs, where they are actually trying to completely rethink cities from the bottom up, right? And they would actually like to come to a city and offer their own digital package, right? So understanding the political economy of this and understanding the sociological and economic and ethical implications of this is something that I have been exploring, and we can, of course, talk about it as we move on. I've also been very much focused on the question of data, and not just the violation of access to data because of privacy or surveillance, but also in terms of who should own it. Should it be citizens and users who should own the data socially or privately, or should it be big companies, right? And I think that the deal that has been put in front of us has been that it's mostly the companies that should own the data, and more in the last 2 years we see a very different debate emerging with more and more insistence on redistributing ownership of that data. So that to me is also a very interesting question, because ultimately who owns it will also determine on what conditions you can access it. And that will also, I think, raise a profound set of ethical and political and other concerns.
Great. I think we're ready to turn to the first question, which is actually very much related to the issue you raised with regard to data, whether it's private or it's public, and what is balance between private and public interests with regard to ownership of the data. But this question, I think, has a larger implication for the whole development of technological industry, and particularly with regard to urban areas, because metropolitan cities and the administrations, they are basically controlling such enormous asset of data with regard to their citizens, and citizens are primarily living now in the cities. And we see that urbanization more or less completed as a phase of development of humanity, so majority of people living in some sort of urban areas. So urban administrations, they have enormous access, or very unprecedented access to data of the citizens. And what is the driving force behind implementation of new technological digital instruments of governance in the cities, of all sort of interaction between urban administrations and the cities, of all sort of services, whether it's a public interest of the cities, of people, so people are customers and people are requiring certain type of technological changes in administrating urban areas, or it's more like privately driven process. So when big tech companies impose their interests on the city administrations and consequently on the people, and then we basically have some technological advance we don't really need, but we have to accept it because it's of interest of the big capital and big business. What do you think? I mean, maybe I'm a little bit exaggerating in framing the question, but I want to be, to a certain extent, even provocative to, to push the discussion further on. And
sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you're pointing to something that has been at the heart of also my critique of this big tech. If you remember, 4 or 5 years ago, nobody was even using that term. It was still very much an industry that was perceived as benevolent and more or less focused on sustainability or efficiency or making cities more livable or making user experiences better. And I think in the last few years, partly as a result of the revelations by Edward Snowden, partly as a result of this scandal related to Cambridge Analytica, partly as a result of the enormous value that these companies have generated for their investors and owners. I mean, we are talking essentially about 7 or 8 of the largest companies in the world by market capitalization. Whether you look at the United States, whether you look at China, you would see that all of a sudden, in society at large, there is a realization that this is an industry that has its lobbyists, and its lobbyists are pushing for its priorities. So in the case of Google, it's a company, Alphabet to be exact, it's a company that spends more on lobbying than many of the banks and even institutions like the Goldman Sachs. So it's, I think, correct to start with a heavy dose of skepticism with regards to what's driving the agenda that yields projects like the Smart City, or that yields celebration of initiatives like the sharing or collaborative economy at the city level, because very often the rhetoric and the discourse is in fact that of sustainability, efficiency, and democratization, while the reality is more of backroom deals between the city administrators and the companies. So I'm all for scrutinizing what's happening behind the scenes. That said, I think it's also hard to deny that there are a lot of processes at the urban level, but also at the national state level, that can surely be optimized with more data. You know, where you put the biking path, where you put, you know, lighting, the frequency with which buses run. I mean, all of that, of course, is quite banal and can be heavily and easily optimized. The question that I think is still rarely posed, for reasons that are not banal, is that, you know, something like efficiency, it's not an unambiguous, self-evident concept. Something that's more efficient for somebody is probably painful to somebody else, right? And I think most of this more rough edges of this problem, they have been ignored, and they have to be ignored if we continue with the model where these firms approach everything as a platform, which means that they can build it once, and then they can offer the same platform whatever city they go to. I mean, that's the primary motivation behind many of the digital technologies. You want to do it once. You know, Uber comes to, you know, a city in India, and they launch, and then they go to a city in China, and from there they go to a city in Brazil, and the software and algorithms and sensors and everything else is more or less the same. This is how they cut costs. So if you really want more flexibility, you then need to raise costs, and somebody has to pay for that, right? And this, I think, brings us to the more important point. Again, I can't speak very certainly or with great certainty about Russia, but in the case of most European cities that have jumped on this smart city digital technology bandwagon, they have been doing it for reasons that have mostly to do with their own shrinking budgets and the kind of austerity agenda that they have been living through. So many of them simply had no money to invest into improving the quality of life for their citizens, and that was the reason why the free or nearly free or temporary free offers from many of those firms looked so tempting. And I think, of course, that would not be something that citizens would easily approve of, so it had to be marketed and sold with a heavy dose of sweet rhetoric about sustainability and efficiency and livability and all of that, which we have experienced in heavy doses in the last decade or so.
I have actually two questions related to what you said. One was, I do understand when you have a kind of intense austerity measures imposed on, you know, on the city administration, and it's a case in so many cases we know. But with regard to big cities like Moscow, like New York, maybe some others, which are rich, and Moscow is an example of a relatively rich city, even on global scale, by global measures, I would say whether they also playing more like a role of playground, letting big tech and customers to interact just in this setting of the city, or they try, and you see examples when they try to play an active role, try to build their own agenda, coming from interest of the consumers, of the public services, of something else? Like whether you see any active role of the big cities in counterbalancing power of the big tech, trying to be defendants with regard to the customer's interest. Do you see any kind of positive examples, or primarily they also try to be just a playground where let Uber provide some services, we just step, I don't know, aside and wait?
Well, no, I mean, there are positive examples. I think they are relatively small and they happen at the level of prototypes. So, I spent most of the year living in Barcelona, actually, where, a different administration was elected a couple of years ago, and their commitment was essentially to changing the terms on which many of the big tech programs, including those of the smart city, were unfolding in the city. So there are experiments happening now in Barcelona with regards to collection and management and ownership of data produced by citizens. There are also efforts to do something about Airbnb, but not because there is some kind of a opposition to the digital wave of progress, but simply because there is quite a lot of resistance to the increasing rents that in a heavily touristic city like Barcelona, the unregulated activity of sites like Airbnb represents. So I think we can point to individual examples. The problem is that, again, you have to focus on what parts of the stack, the proverbial stack, are being covered by this opposition. I am, as much as of a believer I am in cities, I have seen very few examples where cities have had a proactive role in developing an alternative agenda, for example, for artificial intelligence, which now is going to underwrite and underpin many of the other services that will be offered in the city, self-driving cars, optimization of energy consumption, prediction of weather, and so forth. This is something that cities, if they join forces and have a smart strategy, perhaps might be able to replicate if they also strategically coordinate the tendering process, their R&D spending. All of that, I think, is possible. It's just that it would require 4 or 5 sizable cities of the size of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York to essentially question the heavy reliance that they have developed on the private sector and on many of the big tech firms. And that would also require, basically a revolution in how tenders are conducted, because that's where a lot of these problems start, where it's increasingly hard to do tenders on criteria other than cost. Or, in many cases, even in a place like Barcelona, you have to go with the cheapest offer or the cheapest bid, which usually comes from the big firms and not from your own local alternatives to them. So again, this is not to say that cities can be powerless, and I think a city like Moscow and New York, with a lot of budget and a lot of discretionary spending, can also proactively shape this agenda. It's just that it will need to be coordinated with a national agenda. Right? And this is where debates about what's happening in China, where there is clearly a national agenda with regards to technological development, could be useful. But again, here, it's not as if even though cities in China have much autonomy. I mean, they do to some extent, but the technological agenda is still defined at the national level.
Yeah, so basically big cities can unite in overcoming those kind of challenges. Do you think should be any international of big cities?
Internet what?
International. Fifth international of big cities.
Well, I mean, to be honest, if you go and read some of the more kind of, let's say, edgy, radical literature on municipal federalism, people like Murray Bookchin and others, I mean, that has been at the heart of the project, that, if you really want to resist the pressure that's exercised upon you by the global market, cities really need to come together and join forces. The problem is that it would require a very coordinated campaign and having more or less almost a harmonized political and technological agenda, which will be very hard to pull off even in a relatively integrated area like the European Union. So, I mean, there are some encouraging signs. I can tell you that a couple of months ago there were municipal elections in Amsterdam, and you have a relatively, how should I put it, interesting coalition of forces, some of them coming from the Greens, some of them coming from the left, which would like to more or less build on some of the experiences that already occurred in Barcelona. So there is some space to coordinate those policies. I think the bigger problem is the absence of, speaking about Europe, over strategic vision when it comes to industrial policy and technological policy at the level of the European Union itself. And it's not a problem to be tackled at the level of the city. It's a problem that can be ameliorated somewhat, and it can be greatly ameliorated at the level of the cities. There is some willingness at the national level. If there is no willingness at the national level, cities become customers of technology solutions. And as customers of technology solutions, of course, they can band together and demand better ones. But we have not seen it happen with something as basic as software that Microsoft floods everywhere, and cities have not exercised much resistance. So I don't expect it to happen on higher level elements like artificial intelligence or something like that.
Okay, we shouldn't forget this positive agenda of the big cities, how they can implement it and how they can change the landscape. But now I want to turn to a little bit like a negative side of the story of technological development of big tech in the city, because we're talking about dilemma, we're talking about ethical issues. So big tech brings some sort of, negative consequences, some negative externalities for people probably. Can you maybe from either describe it from your experience, from your understanding, from some empirical data, what sort of negative consequences you're talking about, or maybe show us some counterfactual, like on which we base our understanding of this negative scenario of developing if big tech prevails, if big tech basically plays the key role without like being counterbalanced by big cities, either customers or national agendas.
Sure. Well, I think here, I'll give you examples, but I think it's very important that we don't, as they say in English, throw out the baby together with the bathwater, right? Which means that, it's all fine to be finding faults with Uber and Airbnb or Google Sidewalk Labs or the vendors of smart city technologies, but I think we have to do that as long as we are cautious and fully aware, conscious of the fact that ultimately there are ways to turn those systems around. And you can turn those systems around with a different level of data ownership, with a different auditing system of the algorithms, with a different governance system, with a different setup. So I'm not trying to send any technophobic message as such. I'm not advocating reversing urbanization. And there are critical issues to be raised in that context, but I think we always have to keep in mind that there is no monopoly on ideas and on implementation that Uber or Airbnb should have, right, when it comes to tech. So I can easily imagine an Uber that would work in the interest of the citizens and that would not encourage surge pricing, which is when prices suddenly go up when there is a natural emergency, and where you would not have to worry how the driver would rank you as a customer, for example, right? If this is what we decide as a society, as a city, as a nation state, right? So again, I think that there is quite a lot of good that, I don't want to praise those firms, but let me put it this way. I think they have shown us that a somewhat different paradigm is possible, and I think there is nothing wrong in that. I do want to have a public transportation system that's much more decentralized and probably somewhat more responsive to my needs. Whether I have to surrender any interest in using that insight and using that knowledge to build an even better system, it's something that we really have to question. So let me give you an example. So Uber is a company which I think illustrates this quite well. So Uber is, it's a gigantic firm that has managed to raise quite a lot of money from investors, many of them private ones. They have managed to raise dozens of billions from this Japanese entity called SoftBank, which itself either borrowed money or got money from sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. So Uber in North America, Western Europe, for example, they have the capacity and they have the bandwidths to keep losing money. So they can continue losing money for a year, 2 years, 5 years. In the United States, every year they lose $1 billion, right? And sooner or later, of course, once they destroy the competition, they will need to get that money back. So how would they get that money back? they can raise the prices after they have destroyed the competition, which the competition lawyers might have a problem with, or they might replace the drivers with self-driving cars, in which case they will get rid of the labor costs, and in a sense, they can keep the rates as they are right now. And that has been their preferred strategy. They've been pouring billions into building self-driving cars and establishing artificial intelligence research centers. But this second option of completely relying on automation will radically transform the local economies where they operate, because having destroyed the competition and having more or less gotten rid of the workers and the drivers, you end up in a situation where the money that those drivers used to spend on buying a coffee or buying a newspaper or buying an apartment are no longer spent. And ultimately, the fares that you pay to Uber, sooner or later, end up going back to the investors behind the company in Saudi Arabia or Goldman Sachs, in a way that, again, if you continue celebrating the ease of the experience of the service to the consumer, you should be quite happy. But if you would like to open up your eyes a little bit more and look at the broader effect that a company like Uber will have on the local economy, then perhaps you should be worried. Right? And I think very often the debates about digital capitalism, if you will, they continue operating in this neoliberal kind of framework where the consumer, which of course in this case is reimagined as the user, is placed at the center, and everything that happens is re-examined through that lens. Right? And I'm just trying to suggest that in many cases it's not the right lens, and you see it across the board, not just in the case of Uber, although in the case of Airbnb. Right? It's nice that you have a lot of tourists coming to your city, but if that also results in rent prices going up for everybody else, then perhaps it's not as great. Right? And perhaps the defense that companies like Airbnb put up, where they say that we essentially allow the middle classes and sort of small bourgeois entrepreneurs to earn a living by putting their apartments on the market is just not true, because the majority of those apartments are owned by real estate giant firms and have nothing to do with the empowerment of this entrepreneurial real estate small guy that they often refer to in their public statements.
Okay, so you were talking about national agenda as countervailing factor with regard to big tech agenda, and you mentioned China. I want to ask you a little bit more particular question with regard to China. We heard that in China they now introduce a number of innovations with regard to governance, and one of those is so-called social scoring system of social credit. And this system, as we know, is already a practical solution. So they implemented in one of the cities, or maybe a couple of the cities. And those cities quite big. I mean, couple of millions, several millions. So pretty large cities by European standard, at least. And in those cities, the system already counts all sort of actions, all sort of misbehaviors, all sort of kind of social achievements of the citizens. And citizens are getting this scoring, and then they either are receiving some sort of social benefits, or they punished in one way or another. And this is government implementing the system of total control. I mean, that is kind of a different model, and whether you see there are more checks and balances with this model when government implements sort of this big tech solution, or government replicates kind of big tech agenda, or how they kind of relate to each other.
Sure. Well, to some extent, again, I think that knowing the background of this initiative in China, I think helps. As far as I know, it arises from the need of the Chinese government to be able to extend loans to Chinese consumers who do not have credit histories, right? And it's not necessarily a new problem. There are tons of startups in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that are trying to essentially gather as much data points about us from our cell phones, our browsers, all of our other gadgets, in order to make an assessment as to whether they can extend a loan to us or not, because we cannot bring them our wage slips or our payments for the apartment we've been living in or our utility bills. So in the absence of that data, they have to look for other sources of data. So I mean, the context of this in China kind of makes sense. And I think that system, given the needs of the economic system, that system, of course, has the secondary benefit for the Communist Party of being able to shape the behavior of people in a way that is fully automated and fully mediated by digital technology towards the kind of interests of the government. Again, I don't want to be too harsh on that, because if you want to be harsh on that system, you also have to be harsh on many of similar systems that we have also in Western Europe, North America, and I would also gather in much of Eastern and Central Europe, including Russia, where we do have credit scores, right, which are supposed to incorporate a lot of data points in them. We also have systems that shape and nudge our behavior. I mean, the entirety of this debate in behavioral economics around nudging and choice architecture, it's around that. It's about ways in which you can use the information that has been gathered about the user and use some kind of mediating interface, be that screen of a mobile phone or be that some kind of a gadget, to shape behavior towards desired or socially useful goals. Right? So again, in the case of China, I think it's not, let me put it that way, it's more like the reputation economy that so many gurus in Silicon Valley celebrate, but with Chinese characteristics. Right? So in that sense, I think to fixate on that and look at it outside of the context of development in China, which is, essentially, I would say, capitalist development, would be a mistake. So again, it's a system that, taken out of that context, might seem, in fact, very draconian. And I think that's the tendency in a lot of Western media to see it as very draconian. We can debate to what extent it is or it is not. But again, when we make that kind of critique, we have to look back into our own kind of backyard and see that there is plenty of things along those lines in our own. America, if you have committed certain misdemeanors or they suspect you of committing them, you will not get on a plane either. Right? So it's not as if China is the only country with a database that scores people on how likely they are to get on an airplane.
Or if you met with Russian ambassador, huh?
Yes.
For dinner or lunch. I don't know which is worse. So basically, Chinese are kind of shortcutting the way Western big tech is already kind of going. So they basically try to reach the same result, same outcome as Western corporations are already trying to implement for years. Would you say this? Would you agree with this?
Sure. Well, yes and no. I mean, no, only in the sense that there are other parts of the Chinese economy that are not as well developed as Northern America, Western Europe. So if you look at payment systems or banking systems, of course, they did not have such a robust banking sector as Germany or the United States, which meant that Chinese tech firms managed to establish a much stronger presence in payment systems than any American firms ever could aspire to, and probably never will, because they face a much tougher competition from banks. Right? So to some extent, I would not just present the Chinese firms as just copycats. I mean, there are specific features, I think, of the Chinese economy, Chinese society, that puts them actually in the avant-garde. You can make the same argument about surveillance, actually, in that the very specific surveillance needs of the Chinese state have brought about the most sophisticated industry of facial recognition. So if you look at most of the recent tests of how well technologies for facial recognition recognize faces, all the leading ones are from China, in part because they have no restraints in terms of how much data you can fit into the system, but there is also a much greater market and a much greater need. So that aside, I think China is probably the only country at a large scale that has understood that having control over hardware and software and networks is going to be key to retaining control over the economy in general. Because production will be underwritten by some kind of combination of networks and AI and everything else, from transportation to healthcare to energy. And in as much as they have a developmentalist, whatever the right word, developmentalist approach in mind to their society and their economy, I think they would want to preserve that lever, right? And if they lose that lever, essentially their developmentalist model will also stumble. So I think they're doing quite smart things. Again, it's very much steered by the government, which in my opinion does not contradict the experience in the United States, where much of the tech industry throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s was also guided and spearheaded by the government, by the needs of the Cold War, and by essentially a very smart approach to which industries to support and which ones not. That approach has been heavily liberalized and almost abandoned in the United States in the 90s and more recently, and I think America to some extent has come to believe its own myth when it comes to technological development, in that it really believes that what takes to produce a company like Tesla is an Elon Musk, rather than the Defense Department and Energy Department and everybody else working together on steering subsidies and giving money to somebody like Elon Musk. So this cult of the entrepreneur, which was heavily boosted by somebody like Steve Jobs and his experience and his own self-marketing, I think it kind of misled many American policymakers. And it took Trump in the last few months, to actually realize that Chinese have used those 2 decades quite usefully and quite skillfully, and they have managed to develop a sector which lags behind on many dimensions. On semiconductors, they're still behind, and they don't have a ready-made solution. On many other elements, they're still behind, but they're rapidly catching up. And I would think that the fact that China is also experiencing a very fast urbanization process, so it's highly accelerated, also means that the opportunities to use digital technologies for both development and control in the cities would be much greater in China. And it's not by accident that I think that Alibaba was given the task by the Chinese government to actually oversee the development of smart cities in China. I mean, Baidu got self-driving cars, and I think Tencent got healthcare. So it's an area that I think is worth watching, because even though they overlap quite a bit with both global capital and American capital. So, just to give an example, 30% of Alibaba belongs to SoftBank, this giant Japanese firm whose, if you think of it as a Japanese firm, whose geopolitical interests don't necessarily coincide with those of China. So it's not as if their hands are completely untied and they can do whatever they want. So there are all these hurdles, and there is integration at the global level between Chinese capital, American capital, and global capital. That aside, I still think that China is probably the only interesting actor capable of challenging the dominance of big American firms in this space.
Turning to the question we have on the screen, basically, ethical issues of tech cities, full security versus total control. Do you think that, in my intuition, full control, total control is basically sort of synonym to full security. I don't know, if you control everything, you're sort of secured in a way. Or if you controlled totally, you kind of secured because there is no risk not kind of under control. So, but as I understand the meaning of this dilemma, we are basically talking either about security-driven interest when we talk about safety, we talk about interest of people, or interest of controlling something, so either interest of the object or of the subject, interest of those who regulate it, or interest of those who regulate. So probably this kind of ethical issue we offer to discuss about. But also, I think we have to consider what is ethical in this context, whether we have this ethical problematics in general changing with regard to technological advance, or we say that technologies bring new ethics. Is any new ethics of technological, world, of tech city, of tech landscape, or we still stick with the old school kind of ethical standards and try to apply them to the technological development, and in this context, whether they fitting basically ethical standards, whether we complying with kind of ethical rules, or we already breaching them and don't really care, or what's going on?
Well, I mean, I'm far more skeptical of even the term ethics as it's currently being applied to digital technologies, in part because for the most part, it refers to something that users and consumers will have to do in order for whatever technology that now mediates their life to continue working, right? And I think by and large, that's what we mean by ethics of technology these days. It's learning better what it does and how to use it, and that not using it in a way that might break something, essentially. And it becomes almost like outsourcing of the externalities and the negative costs of whatever technology on the shoulders of the user, as opposed to doing something that would actually put more and shift more of the responsibility on the vendor or the platform that's building it, right? So, I mean, of course, you can tell me, to pick a very simple example, you can tell me that cybersecurity, as in the kind of consumer meaning of the term, is something that I, as a user, have to really care for. So I have to install the latest antivirus, I have to pay $10, $15 a month for cyber insurance. I have to do everything, because if I don't, then somebody will attack me and damage my network, my neighbor's network, and I will cause a lot of damage. At the same time, and you can have a perfectly ethical discussion about that and say that you, the user, are to blame because you did not buy cyber insurance for a server. At the same time, I think there is another conversation to be had, and it's the way in which companies, and especially software vendors, by relying on proprietary software, make it actually impossible to examine that software for vulnerabilities. They do everything to prevent that, and then they are the ones who then come to me and sell me antivirus or cyber insurance protection, right? So, and that to me is also an ethical discussion, but that's an ethical discussion that we are having far less often, right? Because ultimately we're talking about the political economy of software, and the way in which public institutions find themselves locked into contracts with big tech, right? And I think this example is a very nice illustration of how conversations about ethics of technology very often conceal conversations about political economy to some extent, right? And I think this is where it would be useful not just to follow down that path completely and keep talking about ethics, but to introduce some of those more ambitious, perhaps, political dimensions. Because ultimately, the systems and technological systems and platforms that we use, they're not made in stone, right? They can look very different. They can have a very different degree of transparency and openness of their source code. The algorithms in them can be more transparent or less transparent. They can be subject to examination or not subject to examination. So, of course, we can hope for some kind of an ethical mandate that will force the companies to comply with that by peer pressure or by appealing to their corporate social responsibility. But I would rather take the extra step and just mandate that in terms of tenders, what software the public sector is allowed to buy. Right? It would be much simpler if we just say, you are obliged to buy just free software, and that's it. Right? So again, it's not that I want to play down the theme of ethics. I just think that very often it has become a term that even the tech industry has embraced fully, because ultimately it's toothless against the real problems, as at least I see them. So, I mean, we can relate it more to full security versus total control. I just wanted to highlight that kind of ambiguity of the term ethics when it comes to technology.
But do you think law should play a more active role in regulating kind of this contradictory elements of development of technological landscape, what do we think would be a role for legal regulation? I mean, because the law, to a certain extent, was derivative to ethical, I don't know, sentiment. I would say that in most of the systems, in the West for sure, law was built on ethics. What now, of course, it's a little bit detached, but still, what do you think as a legal regulation this institution, how can it accommodate and basically endorse all this development, in which sense, and what would be useful, what would be like useless role for the law?
I think here we kind of stumble onto a very interesting philosophical issue, in that there is, of course, a good argument to be made in favor of continuing with this modernist project of law, right? Whereby we still try to deliberate, pass laws that reflect the interests of society, enforce them, and then change or get rid of them if the situation no longer requires that. As a theoretical proposition, I think nothing beats it. There is nothing close that comes close to it that will challenge the theoretical beauty and the democratic appeal of that model. Of course, if you start in the reality of here and now, you immediately see the impracticability of the system, and that there are just so many loops and holes in ways in which laws are passed, developed, and voted upon, which, given the immense disbalance and inequality between the lobbying power of citizens and the lobbying power of big firms, results in big firms winning almost all the time. So they, in fact, I think, our perception even of neoliberalism is very wrong, because we often think that it's about getting rid of laws, right? Which, of course, is not at all the case. It's about writing laws that favor the accumulation of capital or favor particular industries within that accumulation process. So given that predisposition, I think there is also another argument that can be made, which is to say we would like to build technologies that will not be corruptible and susceptible to lobbying and to any kind of external manipulation which big power can exercise upon this technology. So WikiLeaks, to give you one example, would probably be an example of that model, whereby the hope, to some extent, leaving all the hype aside, you can say that the blockchain is meant to do that also, even though there is no big political force behind blockchain as there is behind WikiLeaks. But in the case of WikiLeaks, the working model is that. It's not the idea that you can somehow rely on the laws of the freedom of expression in order to make truth visible and public. Rather, it's relying on the invincibility of technological infrastructure and encryption standards and mechanisms in order to make that truth visible, even if the legal protections would not suffice. Of course, the reality of that is very different, because you do need, in the case of Julian Assange, conventions guiding the status of refugees, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you have a strong state, Ecuador protecting him. So it's a somewhat complex case, but I think the overall vector of that example is quite interesting, because to me, it's kind of a halfway through between postmodernism and modernism, in that you're still trying to improve the world somehow, but you are cynical enough or realistic enough not to have perfect faith in the incorruptibility of the legal process, given the current imbalance of forces between citizens and corporations.
Yeah, you were mentioning that basically big tech is hijacking our democratic process and legislative process, and to a certain extent they're influencing laws, how they would be delivered. But also we can say to a certain extent that some big tech players, they basically build their own legal systems and their own systems of rules and standards. And there is a certain competition between those two systems, imposed by the states and system imposed by the corporations. Do you see that there are different underlying principles differentiating those two systems, and which are more suitable for the future like stage of development and which is more fair to a certain extent?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I mean, this is also the reason why I am not as troubled by the Chinese social credit system as some people are, because we do have alternatives to the Chinese social credit system, and those are privately run reputation systems administered by companies like eBay or PayPal, which of course, you know, have been quite forceful and quite explicit in endorsing an agenda of private governance where, you know, the rules of their own platform create reputations for us that we can then carry to other economic and political actors, right? And I think this idea of creating rules and systems and networks of private governance whereby you can completely circumvent public law and rely solely on private contract law, it's very strong in Silicon Valley, and it's also very strong in the American libertarian community, but to some extent also in Western Europe. And I think, to me, if the choice is between a state-run system and a privately run system, you know, it's not an easily answered question, right? I mean, if it's a democratic state, I will surely side with the state. Right? And I think it's time to maybe also for us to acknowledge the reality of digital capitalism today. And the reality is that many of these big tech firms seek to replicate many parts of the state. You know, they seek to replicate it to some extent on welfare. I mean, that's how many of them present themselves. We will cure cancer. We will make sure that you know exactly when you need to take this pill. I mean, they actually present themselves as an extension of, you know, the library system or the university system or the healthcare system or the transportation system. And to some extent, it's the same thing with reputation and identity. You know, how do you prove to Airbnb that you are who you are? You can submit your passport, a copy of your passport, or you can essentially log in with your Facebook account, right? And I'm absolutely sure that in a year or two, if you completely lose this option of logging in with your passport, or proving who you are with your passport, and just relying on Facebook, we will barely notice because so many of us already integrated into the social networking systems. So for me, again, it's a big... I don't know how much I should go into kind of abstract thinking about it, but I think that theoretically we have made a mistake of assuming that currently existing capitalism presupposes the state to continue carrying on certain functions. And I think it's a theoretical mistake. And that, you know, private sector, and especially technological sector, is more than capable of overtaking those functions and providing them themselves in a way that would not somehow undermine the base of accumulation that, you know, any capitalist regime needs to function.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have one question, but I mean, we have some loyal listeners in the audience left. So maybe anyone want to like contribute to ask a question. If not, then I will ask my last question. So then my question would be, we see that tech city is becoming a kind of testing ground or in avant-garde of technological change, what's happening. Do you think we really like, I mean, our future, our future would look like modern smart cities looking, and it would capture basically all the human population one day or another. And if we're losing this battle with the big tech and public interest would be subordinated to the interest of basically private companies in development or in a way in defining the way of development of tech cities, that would be the case for the rest of humanity. And basically on planetary level, we would have exactly same outcome like in the near future.
Yeah, well, I think we also, I mean, I hope I didn't send that impression. I mean, I would be quite, I'm still quite skeptical about the ability of many of these digital platforms to deliver what they promise. Even if you look at some of the most highly profiled examples like Google Sidewalk Labs, essentially it's not a tech project, it's a real estate project where Google will run the tech end and the back end that is digital, but the actual money for the financing of this part of Toronto is by and large supposed to come from private developers, real estate firms, and so forth. And it's not obvious that they will bring that money, and it's not obvious that the added value that Google will provide by running the digital infrastructure of that project will justify the immense investments dumped into this project. So again, you can of course say that the future is going to be digital. And I would agree with that, because ultimately there is still quite a lot of money to be made in extracting the data from us and in selling us products. And then, in as much as global capitalist economy keeps on going and spinning, there will be money to be made in digitizing everything, because by and large, it allows you to do things more efficiently. That does not mean that the specific projects of the smart city or the digital city or something else will necessarily find a profitable niche. Because so far, other than contributing to organizing many conferences and publishing books and brochures and doing a lot of exhibitions and expos, there is very little savings or money. And most people, don't look at big cities, look at small cities. So, everybody points to Santander in Spain. It's one of the first cities where this rhetoric kind of emerged. Today, there is an interesting article in Handelsblatt, the German newspaper, profiling Santander. And they basically say that the majority of the population in Santander has never heard of any initiatives related to the smart city, even though they dumped millions and millions of dollars into it. And I think this is probably more likely on the smart city, digital city end. That, again, does not mean that our lives will not be digital and digitized. They'll be digitized for other reasons. But I still remain quite skeptical as to the ability of these platforms, A, to deliver, and B, to become profitable. They can, of course, keep draining public money, which is their most likely ending scenario, but that does not mean that they bring anything to the table.
Thank you, Evgeny. I think we're more or less done, and already speakers for next session are coming. So thank you everyone who were with us. Спасибо большое. До свидания.